If humanity were to disappear tonight, not with fire or catastrophe, but quietly, without warning, how long would it take for the Earth to erase the evidence that we were ever here? In a few decades, streets would crack and split as plants forced their way through concrete. In a few centuries, buildings would collapse inward, reduced to heaps of stone and rust. In a few thousand years, rivers would change course, coastlines would shift, and cities would be buried beneath sediment and forest. And in time, almost everything we built would vanish. Stone tools last, bones last, but glass shatters, steel corrodes, and digital memory disappears completely. What we call history is not a complete record of the past. It is a narrow window, shaped by chance, preservation, and decay. It is not the story of everything that happened, but only the story of what survived long enough to be discovered. Entire civilizations have existed without leaving behind names, monuments, or written words. They lived, adapted, struggled, and died, and the Earth absorbed them as if they had never been. And yet we speak of civilization as though it were permanent, as though once achieved, it could never be lost. We imagine ourselves standing at the end of history, not realizing that history has ended before, many times. For the vast majority of human existence, civilization did not exist at all. There were no cities, no nations, no borders, no governments, and no written laws. There were only humans and the world they inhabited. So before we can understand civilization, before we can trace its rise, its power, and its collapse, we must first understand the long stretch of time when humanity lived entirely without it. Because civilization is not humanity's natural state. It is an experiment, and like all experiments, it can fail. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. For nearly all of that time, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, moving through landscapes that were often harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving. They lived in small groups bound by kinship and shared survival. They followed migrating animals, gathered wild plants, and adapted continuously to changing climates. They possessed an intimate understanding of their environments, developed over countless generations. These humans were not simple or naive. They were skilled observers, toolmakers, navigators, and storytellers. They memorized the land, the stars, the behavior of animals, and the rhythms of the seasons. They survived ice ages that reshaped entire continents. They lived through periods when much of the world was colder, drier, and far less stable than it is today. They endured extreme environmental shifts that would challenge even modern societies. And yet this immense span of human life left behind almost nothing. Wood decays, flesh disappears, oral traditions vanish the moment no one remains to speak them. Stone tools survive, but stone tools cannot tell us what people believed, what they feared, or what they hoped for. They cannot tell us how people understood their place in the world. Most human lives were lived beyond the reach of history, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the world itself began to change. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth entered a period of unusual climatic stability. The violent fluctuations that had defined previous ages began to ease. Temperatures became more predictable. Seasons followed clearer patterns. The last great ice sheets retreated, releasing vast amounts of fresh water and reshaping coastlines. Sea levels rose, flooding plains and erasing ancient landscapes. This moment of stability was not created by humans, but it made something entirely new possible. Agriculture. Growing food requires patience, planning, and predictability. Seeds must be planted with the expectation that rain will come, that frost will not arrive too early, that the land will remain usable year after year. For most of human history, this kind of certainty did not exist. But now, for the first time, it did. And once agriculture became possible, everything else began to change. Humans started to remain in one place for longer periods of time. Temporary camps became permanent settlements. Simple shelters became homes meant to last across generations. People cleared land, planted crops, and domesticated animals. They stored food, creating reserves for the future rather than consuming everything immediately. This single shift altered the structure of human life. Stored food created surplus. Surplus allowed population growth. Population growth demanded organization, and organization introduced hierarchy. Someone had to decide how food was distributed. Someone had to protect stored resources. Someone had to resolve disputes when scarcity returned. Civilization did not emerge because humans suddenly became wiser or more advanced. It emerged because managing settled life required new forms of control, and control reshaped society. As settlements expanded, personal relationships were no longer enough to hold communities together. In small groups, trust is built through familiarity. In large populations, trust must be replaced with systems. Rules were established, rituals were formalized, symbols gained power. Religion became a framework not only for belief, but for order. Shared myths explained the world, justified authority, and gave meaning to obedience. Leaders claimed connection to the divine. Priests interpreted signs from unseen forces. Cosmic order mirrored social order. These beliefs were not merely stories. They were tools that allowed thousands of unrelated people to live together under shared expectations. Without them, early civilization would have fractured under its own weight. Eventually, some settlements crossed a threshold that transformed them forever. They became cities. Cities where food was grown outside the walls, where people specialized as builders, artisans, soldiers, and administrators, where power concentrated in the hands of a few. These cities did not arise in a single place or time. They appeared independently across the world wherever conditions allowed, in river valleys where floods replenished soil, along trade routes where goods and ideas moved freely, in isolated regions where human ingenuity adapted to local constraints. Civilization was not invented once. It emerged again and again. And that fact carries a profound implication. If civilization can arise repeatedly, then it can also disappear repeatedly. Cities amplify human potential. They also amplify human ambition. They gather wealth, labor, knowledge, and power into dense spaces. They create inequality, competition, and desire for expansion. Once cities exist, they do not remain content to simply survive. They seek to grow. They seek to dominate. And with that shift, civilization enters its next phase. Because the story of civilization is not only about creation, it is also about conquest. Once cities existed, the balance that had sustained early civilization began to shift in subtle but irreversible ways because a city is never truly self-contained, and it never exists in isolation from the world beyond its walls. Cities require resources in quantities that the immediate land around them cannot always provide. They need timber, stone, metals, water, labor, and food in volumes that increase every generation. And as populations grow, so do expectations, ambitions, and fears. At first, cities traded. They exchanged surplus for scarcity, ideas for materials, and knowledge for influence. Trade routes spread across deserts, rivers, and seas, quietly binding distant communities together long before anyone understood how vast the world truly was. But trade alone could not satisfy the growing appetite of civilization. Eventually, cities began to look outward, not just with curiosity, but with desire. Expansion rarely begins with conquest. It begins with necessity. A drought reduces harvests. A population outgrows its farmland. A rival city controls access to vital resources. In these moments, violence becomes an extension of survival. Walls are built not only to keep enemies out, but to define who belongs inside. Weapons improve, not for glory, but for efficiency. Standing armies replace temporary warriors because conflict becomes constant rather than exceptional. And with armies comes hierarchy on a scale never seen before. Commanders, generals, and kings emerge as permanent figures of authority. Power consolidates in individuals who can mobilize thousands of lives with a single decision. Thus, the empire is born. An empire is more than a large state. It is a system designed to project power far beyond its origin. It absorbs other cultures, extracts resources, and imposes order across vast distances. Empires do not rely solely on force. They rely on administration, law, and ideology. Roads are built so armies can move quickly. Taxes are collected to fund expansion. Languages are standardized so orders can be understood. Laws are codified so authority appears rational rather than arbitrary. And above all, empires tell stories about themselves. Stories that say expansion is destiny. Stories that say order is preferable to chaos. Stories that say the empire exists for the good of all. These stories are powerful. They allow people who will never meet the ruler to believe in the system that rules them. Across the ancient world, empires rose independently, each shaped by its environment, its technology, and its beliefs, yet all following strikingly similar patterns. In river valleys, centralized states formed around irrigation and agriculture. In steppe regions, mobile societies built empires through speed and coordination. In coastal regions, naval power extended influence across seas. Despite their differences, all empires faced the same fundamental challenge: control. How do you govern millions of people across thousands of miles without losing authority? The solution was complexity. Layers of bureaucracy multiplied. Officials recorded harvests, censuses, and taxes. Messengers carried information faster than ever before, but never fast enough to prevent misunderstanding. As empires expanded, they became more sophisticated. And as they became more sophisticated, they became more fragile. Empire creates prosperity, but it also creates dependence. Cities rely on distant farms. Armies rely on long supply lines. Governments rely on constant revenue. When everything functions perfectly, empires appear invincible. But perfection is rare. A failed harvest in one region can destabilize an entire system. A rebellion in a distant province can drain resources from the center. A new rival can exploit weakness faster than bureaucracy can respond. The very networks that make empires powerful also make them vulnerable. And history shows again and again that empires do not collapse suddenly. They unravel. The signs of decline are often invisible to those living through them. Borders stretch thinner each generation. Military victories become more expensive and less decisive. Corruption spreads quietly, normalized as necessity rather than recognized as decay. Citizens adapt. They adjust their expectations. They accept decline as normal because they have never known anything else. Meanwhile, inequality deepens. Wealth concentrates in the hands of elites who benefit from the system even as it weakens. The gap between rulers and ruled widens, creating resentment that simmers beneath the surface. Empires rarely fall because of a single cause. They fall because too many pressures accumulate at once. Climate shifts disrupt agriculture. Resource depletion undermines economies. Disease spreads rapidly through dense populations. External rivals test weakened borders. When collapse comes, it often appears sudden in retrospect. But for those living within the empire, it feels slow, confusing, and deeply personal. Institutions fail first. Trust erodes. Local authorities replace distant ones. Trade routes break down. Cities shrink. Knowledge becomes harder to preserve. And eventually, the empire becomes a memory. What remains after an empire collapses is rarely nothing. People survive. Cultures persist. Fragments of law, language, and belief endure. But the scale changes. Complex systems simplify. Global networks fragment into local ones. Life becomes more immediate, more precarious. This pattern has repeated across continents and centuries. The names change. The technologies differ. But the structure remains the same. Rise, expansion, overreach, decline. Empires are not mistakes. They are outcomes. They emerge naturally from the logic of civilization itself. When humans organize, accumulate, and centralize power, the result is almost always expansion, and expansion always carries the seeds of collapse. This is not a moral judgment. It is a historical observation. Yet even as empires fell, civilization did not end. It transformed. Knowledge moved across cultures. Ideas survived conquest. Technologies outlived the states that created them. Civilization is resilient in fragments, even when it fails as a whole. And this resilience allowed humanity to rebuild again and again, often on the ruins of what came before. But each rebuilding brought new complexity, new ambition, and new risk. Because the next phase of civilization is not defined by land or empire alone. It is defined by connection, by the linking of distant worlds, by the acceleration of change, by the moment when civilization becomes truly global. And once that happens, collapse is no longer local. As civilizations expanded beyond their original borders, something unprecedented began to happen. Not suddenly and not intentionally, but gradually as trade routes stretched farther, ships sailed longer distances, and travelers carried more than just goods from one world to another. They carried ideas. For most of human history, civilizations developed in relative isolation, shaped primarily by local geography, climate, and tradition. But once long-distance contact became regular rather than rare, no civilization could remain entirely separate from the rest. Trade routes became arteries of exchange, linking deserts to mountains, river valleys to coastlines, and continents to one another, creating a web of interaction that slowly wrapped around the known world. Along these routes moved spices, metals, textiles, and food, but also religions, philosophies, technologies, and diseases, transforming societies in ways that were often impossible to predict. Civilizations did not simply meet each other, they collided. Contact between civilizations was rarely equal. When societies with different levels of technology, organization, or military capacity encountered one another, imbalance followed quickly, and imbalance almost always led to domination. Some civilizations expanded through commerce and diplomacy, weaving influence subtly into existing structures, while others expanded through force, conquest, and the deliberate destruction of rival systems. Yet even violent conquest did not erase culture completely. Languages blended, beliefs merged, customs adapted. Civilization proved capable of absorbing the foreign and reshaping it into something new, even as it destroyed the political structures that once supported it. This process of collision and synthesis became one of the most powerful drivers of historical change. Across Eurasia, networks of exchange connected societies that had never seen each other face to face, yet were deeply interdependent. Silk traveled thousands of miles from its origin. Gold and silver flowed between empires. Ideas about mathematics, astronomy, and medicine crossed borders more easily than armies ever could. Knowledge accumulated, not linearly, but unevenly, moving forward in one place while stagnating or even disappearing in another. Civilization advanced not as a single march toward progress, but as a shifting mosaic of innovation and loss. But connection came with cost. The same routes that carried wealth and wisdom also carried catastrophe. Diseases that had evolved in dense populations spread rapidly into societies with no immunity, causing demographic collapses that reshaped entire regions. Trade integrated economies, but it also made them vulnerable to distant events beyond local control. A failure in one region could echo across continents. For the first time, civilization became systemically fragile. As contact intensified, civilizations began to define themselves not only by who they were, but by who they were not. Identity hardened. Borders became ideological as well as physical. Beliefs became markers of belonging. Differences became sources of fear and justification for conflict. Religion, once a local organizing force, transformed into global systems of belief, capable of uniting vast populations under shared moral frameworks, but also capable of deepening divisions between those who believed and those who did not. Civilization gained cohesion but lost flexibility. Over time, the accumulation of contact, conflict, and exchange reshaped the structure of power itself. Empires grew larger, but also more complex. Rulers governed increasingly diverse populations, requiring tolerance in some areas and repression in others. Administrative systems expanded. Legal codes multiplied. Information networks strained under their own weight. The success of civilization depended more than ever on coordination, and coordination became harder with every generation. Eventually, the center could no longer hold everything together. Local authorities gained autonomy, regional identities strengthened, imperial unity weakened. What followed was not always dramatic collapse, but gradual transformation. Old empires fractured into successor states. Power decentralized. Innovation slowed in some areas and accelerated in others. Civilization did not vanish, it reconfigured. In the spaces left by collapsing empires, new societies emerged, shaped by the ruins of the past and the pressures of the present. They inherited roads, cities, and institutions, but often lacked the resources or stability to maintain them at previous scales. Life became more localized. Trade networks shortened. Knowledge became fragmented. Yet even in these periods of contraction, the memory of civilization endured, carried through texts, traditions, and shared myths about lost golden ages. The idea of civilization itself became something to aspire to, something that could be rebuilt. And rebuilt it was, because history does not move in straight lines. It pulses. Periods of integration are followed by periods of fragmentation. Expansion gives way to contraction. Complexity collapses into simplicity, only to rise again in new forms. This rhythm defines the long arc of civilization. But eventually, a transformation occurred that altered this rhythm permanently. A moment when connection became global, not regional, when expansion crossed oceans, when no society remained untouched by the actions of another. This was not merely another phase, it was a turning point. Because from this moment forward, the fate of civilizations would become increasingly intertwined, and collapse, when it came, would no longer be contained. There came a moment in human history when distance began to lose its meaning, not because the world had grown smaller, but because human reach had grown longer, stretching across oceans that had once been absolute boundaries between civilizations. For thousands of years, seas had separated worlds as effectively as mountains or deserts, allowing cultures to develop independently, each believing itself to be the center of existence, each unaware of the vast human story unfolding beyond the horizon. But improvements in navigation, shipbuilding, and cartography slowly transformed the oceans from barriers into pathways, and once those pathways opened, they could never be closed again. Civilizations that had never known one another suddenly found themselves connected, often violently, sometimes accidentally, but always irreversibly. This was not simply exploration, it was integration. When distant lands were first encountered, they were not seen as equal parts of a shared world, but as opportunities, resources, and extensions of existing ambitions interpreted through the familiar logic of empire and expansion. Foreign shores became maps to be claimed, peoples to be categorized, and landscapes to be reorganized according to distant priorities. The meeting of civilizations was rarely mutual. It was asymmetrical. One side arrived with ships, weapons, and written systems of authority. The other faced disruption on a scale it had never experienced. Entire societies were transformed within a single generation, not through gradual adaptation, but through shock. The consequences of global contact were profound and uneven. Some regions accumulated extraordinary wealth, fueled by trade, extraction, and forced labor. Others experienced demographic collapse as disease spread faster than understanding. Plants, animals, and ideas crossed oceans, reshaping diets, economies, and environments in ways that no one fully understood at the time. Civilization was no longer local or regional. It was planetary. And for the first time, events in one part of the world could permanently alter life everywhere else. As global networks expanded, power began to concentrate in new ways. Wealth flowed towards centers of trade and finance. States grew stronger, not just through land ownership, but through control of commerce and information. Corporations emerged alongside governments, wielding influence that rivaled traditional authority. The logic of civilization evolved. Land was no longer the primary source of power. Movement was. Ships, trade routes, currencies, and contracts became the new foundations of dominance. Civilization began to run on abstraction. This abstraction changed how humans related to one another. People became numbers in ledgers. Labor became a commodity. Distance made suffering easier to ignore. Decisions made in distant offices reshaped lives thousands of miles away, often without the decision-makers ever witnessing the consequences of their actions. Civilization grew more efficient. It also grew more detached. At the same time, knowledge accelerated. Printing allowed ideas to spread faster than any army. Scientific inquiry challenged ancient assumptions about the universe. Technology advanced not through isolated invention, but through cumulative progress shared across borders. For the first time, civilization began to see itself as capable of mastering nature rather than merely adapting to it. This belief would define the modern world. Yet mastery came with unintended consequences. Forests were cleared faster than they could regenerate. Soils were exhausted. Animals were driven to extinction. Civilization expanded as though resources were infinite, assuming that growth itself was proof of success. The Earth absorbed these changes silently, slowly, without immediate collapse. And because the consequences were delayed, they were ignored. As global civilization matured, inequality deepened both within societies and between them. Some regions industrialized rapidly, harnessing new energy sources to multiply productivity. Others were locked into roles as suppliers of raw materials, their development constrained by systems designed elsewhere. The world became connected but not equal. Civilization spoke the language of progress, but delivered it unevenly. Industrialization marked a turning point not only in technology, but in the tempo of life itself. Machines replaced muscle. Cities expanded beyond anything previously imagined. Time became standardized, measured, optimized. Human life accelerated. And with acceleration came dependence. Civilization now relied on systems so vast and interconnected that no single person fully understood how they worked. Power grids, supply chains, financial markets, and communication networks became the unseen foundations of daily life. When they functioned, they were invisible. When they failed, everything stopped. For the first time in history, civilization became truly global, not just in reach, but in vulnerability. A disruption in one region could cascade across continents. A decision in one nation could reshape the future of many. The world had become a single system, and like all complex systems, it carried the risk of systemic failure. Yet alongside this fragility came unprecedented potential. Education spread, life expectancy increased, knowledge accumulated faster than ever before. Civilization reached heights that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. And with those heights came a question that no previous civilization had ever needed to ask. Not whether civilization could expand further, but whether it could endure. Because the next phase of civilization is unlike all those that came before. It is defined not by conquest of land, but by control of energy, information, and the future itself. And the consequences of failure are no longer local or regional. There was a moment in history when civilization stopped moving at a human pace and began moving at the pace of machines. A moment when progress was no longer measured across generations, but across years, months, and eventually moments, transforming not only how societies functioned, but how humans perceived time itself. Before this transformation, change was slow enough to feel natural. A person could be born, live, and die in a world that still felt familiar. But acceleration shattered that continuity. Each generation began to inhabit a world fundamentally different from the one before it. The harnessing of concentrated energy altered everything. Coal, oil, and gas compressed millions of years of stored sunlight into fuels that could be burned in seconds, releasing power on a scale no civilization had ever possessed. With this energy came factories, engines, and machines capable of multiplying human labor beyond any biological limit. Production surged, transportation accelerated, cities expanded outward and upward. Civilization no longer depended primarily on muscle, wind, or water. It depended on extraction. This shift created unprecedented abundance, but it also rewired civilization's foundations. Growth became an expectation rather than an outcome. Economies were redesigned around continuous expansion. Stability was no longer enough. Civilization began to require constant increase, more production, more consumption, more energy, just to maintain itself. And with each increase, dependence deepened. Acceleration reshaped human life in subtle but profound ways. Time was divided, scheduled, optimized. Work became specialized to the point where individuals could no longer see the whole of what they were contributing to. People became components within systems far larger than themselves. Identity shifted. Individuals increasingly defined themselves not by land, lineage, or tradition, but by occupation, productivity, and economic role. Civilization grew efficient. It also grew impersonal. As industrial civilization expanded, it reshaped the planet itself. Rivers were redirected, mountains were mined, atmospheres were altered. The scale of human influence crossed a threshold beyond which it could no longer be considered temporary or reversible. For the first time, civilization became a geological force. The Earth began to record human activity in its layers of rock, ice, and sediment. And yet, because these changes unfolded gradually, they were easy to dismiss. Acceleration also transformed conflict. Wars were no longer fought primarily with blades and shields, but with machines capable of destruction at unprecedented speed and scale. Entire cities could be erased in moments. The logic of empire gave way to the logic of deterrence. Power was no longer demonstrated by expansion alone, but by the capacity for annihilation. Civilization learned that it could destroy itself, and once that knowledge existed, it could never be forgotten. At the same time, information began to move faster than any army or ship ever could. Telegraphs, radios, and eventually digital networks collapsed distance almost completely. Ideas spread instantly. Narratives competed globally. Perception became as important as reality. Civilization entered an age where control of information rivaled control of territory. Truth fragmented. Authority weakened. And consensus became harder to sustain. Acceleration brought undeniable achievements. Diseases were treated. Life expectancy increased. Education expanded beyond elites. More people lived longer, safer lives than at any previous point in history. But these gains came with new forms of vulnerability. Civilization's systems grew so complex that failure in one area could cascade unpredictably into others. Resilience gave way to optimization. Efficiency replaced redundancy. And optimization leaves little room for error. The modern world began to feel stable precisely because it was tightly controlled. Supply chains delivered food seamlessly. Energy flowed invisibly through networks. Digital systems coordinated finance, communication, and governance. Most people no longer understood how these systems worked. They only noticed them when they failed. Acceleration also intensified inequality. Those who controlled technology, capital, and information gained disproportionate influence over the direction of civilization. Others were displaced, marginalized, or rendered economically invisible. Civilization advanced, but not together. The gap between those who benefited from acceleration and those who bore its costs widened steadily. And beneath all of this movement, production, and innovation, a quieter transformation was underway. The Earth was responding. Temperatures rose gradually, then noticeably. Weather patterns shifted. Ecosystems destabilized. Civilization had built its power on assumptions of environmental stability that no longer held. And because the consequences unfolded over decades rather than days, they were easy to postpone, rationalize, or ignore. By the time civilization recognized the scale of the challenge it had created, it had already become dependent on the very systems causing the damage. Energy could not simply be abandoned. Growth could not easily be halted. Complexity could not be undone without consequence. Civilization found itself trapped by its own success. This is the paradox of acceleration. The same forces that lifted civilization to unprecedented heights also narrowed its margins for survival. Every gain increased dependence. Every solution introduced new risks. The system became faster, stronger, and more fragile at the same time. And so humanity entered a new phase of its story, one defined not by ignorance of consequences, but by awareness of them. For the first time, civilization could see the trajectory it was on. The question was no longer whether civilization could grow, it was whether it could change direction. For the first time in the entire history of civilization, humanity now lives in an era where the future is not simply unknown, but actively shaped by choices being made in the present. Choices whose consequences stretch so far forward that they exceed the lifespan of any individual, any institution, and perhaps even any civilization that currently exists. Previous societies collapsed without fully understanding why. They experienced droughts, invasions, resource depletion, and internal decay as isolated crises, rarely grasping the broader systems at work. Modern civilization is different. It sees the patterns, it recognizes the warnings, and yet recognition alone does not guarantee change. Civilization today is a single, tightly coupled system. Energy, food, water, finance, communication, and governance are interwoven so deeply that stress in one domain reverberates through all the others. A drought affects agriculture. Agriculture affects markets. Markets affect stability. Stability affects trust. And trust, once lost, is difficult to restore. This interdependence makes civilization powerful. It also makes it fragile in ways no previous civilization ever experienced. The risks facing modern civilization are not singular. They are cumulative. Climate instability alters environments faster than adaptation can occur. Resource extraction pushes ecosystems toward irreversible thresholds. Technological systems evolve faster than ethical frameworks designed to govern them. Each problem alone would be manageable. Together, they form a convergence. As complexity increases, prediction becomes harder. Systems designed for efficiency struggle under uncertainty. Institutions built for stability fail to respond to rapid change. Civilization begins to feel brittle, not because it lacks intelligence or innovation, but because it has optimized itself for conditions that no longer exist. History suggests that civilizations rarely collapse when they are weak. They collapse when they are strong but inflexible, when adaptation is slower than disruption, when short-term incentives overpower long-term survival, when success blinds societies to their own vulnerability. The past does not repeat itself exactly, but it echoes. At the same time, civilization has never possessed greater tools for understanding itself. Data reveals patterns invisible to earlier generations. Science uncovers mechanisms once attributed to fate or divine will. Global communication allows awareness to spread instantly. The capacity for coordinated action exists. Whether the will exists remains uncertain. Modern civilization faces a choice unlike any before it, not whether to expand or conquer, but whether to restrain itself. Restraint is historically rare. Civilizations are built on momentum. They grow because growth is rewarded. Slowing down feels like failure, even when speed becomes dangerous. Yet adaptation does not require collapse. History shows that societies can transform when pressures are recognized early enough and when narratives change. Civilization is not only infrastructure and systems, it is belief, what people value, what they consider success, what futures they imagine as desirable. Change begins not with technology, but with meaning. The greatest challenge facing civilization may not be environmental, technological, or economic. It may be psychological. Human minds evolved for immediacy, not abstraction, for local consequences, not global ones, for short-term survival, not long-term stewardship. Civilization asks humanity to transcend its own instincts, and that is not easy. Still, uncertainty does not equal inevitability. Collapse is possible. So is transformation. History is filled with endings that felt permanent and beginnings that seemed impossible. Civilization has reinvented itself before, but never at this scale, never with the entire planet at stake. The future will judge modern civilization not by its achievements, but by whether it understood the moment it was living in, whether it recognized that power without wisdom is temporary, that growth without balance is fragile, that survival is not guaranteed by intelligence alone. Civilization is not a line moving forward. It is a balance constantly renegotiated between ambition and restraint, between innovation and humility, between expansion and care. And that balance is being tested now. What comes next is not written. History does not end. It pauses, shifts, and continues in forms that are often unrecognizable to those who came before. The story of civilization is still being told. The present moment often feels ordinary to those living inside it, not because it lacks significance, but because significance is difficult to perceive while it is still unfolding, while outcomes remain uncertain and consequences have not yet fully arrived. Past civilizations also lived this way. They did not wake up believing they were approaching a turning point. They believed they were solving immediate problems, responding to pressures, making reasonable decisions within the limits of what they could see and understand. Modern civilization is no different. It moves forward one choice at a time, guided less by long-term vision than by short-term necessity, convenience, and momentum accumulated over centuries. The systems that sustain daily life today are so reliable that they fade into the background of awareness. Food appears in markets with little thought given to the vast networks required to produce and transport it. Electricity flows silently through wires, assumed to be permanent rather than conditional. Information arrives instantly, creating the illusion that knowledge itself is effortless. This reliability breeds confidence, and confidence, when uninterrupted, slowly transforms into assumption. Assumption is dangerous for civilizations. It encourages the belief that tomorrow will resemble today, that systems which have never failed will never fail, that complexity itself is proof of permanence. But complexity is not strength by default. It is leverage. It amplifies both capability and consequence. As civilization grows more interconnected, individual societies lose the ability to isolate themselves from global forces. No nation exists independently of climate systems. No economy operates outside global markets. No technology remains contained within its place of origin. This interconnectedness creates shared destiny, whether recognized or not. At the same time, the pace of change challenges human perception. Events unfold faster than cultural adaptation. Technological capability outstrips social consensus. Innovation races ahead while meaning struggles to keep up. Civilization moves faster than the stories people use to understand it. And when narratives lag behind reality, confusion fills the gap. Confusion weakens cohesion. Without shared understanding, trust erodes. Without trust, cooperation fractures. Without cooperation, systems designed for interdependence begin to strain. Civilization does not collapse only through material failure. It collapses when people stop believing in the structures that hold them together. Throughout history, periods of transformation have been accompanied by anxiety, uncertainty, and polarization. Old certainties lose credibility. New frameworks feel incomplete or threatening. Societies search for stability in familiar identities, even when those identities no longer match the conditions of the world. This tension is not new. It is part of every major civilizational shift. Yet modern civilization experiences this tension at unprecedented scale. Billions of people are negotiating change simultaneously. Voices multiply faster than consensus can form. Local realities clash with global narratives. The result is noise, and within noise, clarity becomes rare. Still, beneath the turbulence, civilization continues to function. People work, build, learn, create, and care for one another. Communities persist. Institutions adapt slowly and unevenly. History is not only collapse and catastrophe, it is also continuity. Civilization has always existed in this space between fragility and resilience. It survives not because it is invulnerable, but because it is capable of response. Response does not always mean preservation. Sometimes it means transformation. Transformation rarely arrives as a single moment. It unfolds gradually, unevenly through countless decisions made without full awareness of their cumulative impact. Most people do not experience history as turning points. They experience it as life. What makes the present era distinct is not that it faces challenges, but that those challenges are understood as global, interconnected, and long-term. This awareness changes the nature of responsibility. It extends accountability beyond borders, beyond lifetimes, beyond immediate outcomes. Civilization is being asked to think beyond itself. Whether it can do so remains an open question. But history suggests that civilizations are not judged by their intentions, only by their outcomes. And outcomes are shaped not only by power or intelligence, but by patience, humility, and the ability to learn from patterns that repeat. For now, civilization continues. It adapts, resists, experiments, and hesitates. It advances in some areas and stalls in others. It holds together, even as strains become visible. The story is still unfolding. Civilization continues to move forward not as a single unified entity, but as a vast collection of overlapping systems, cultures, and intentions, all interacting at once, often without coordination, often without shared understanding, yet bound together by consequences that no longer respect borders or distance. Every day, decisions are made that seem small in isolation. A policy adjusted, a technology released, a resource extracted, a system optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. Individually, these choices appear rational, even necessary. Collectively, they shape trajectories that are difficult to reverse. History is built this way, not through dramatic declarations, but through accumulation. One of the defining characteristics of modern civilization is that it has become self-referential. It measures success through metrics it created. It validates progress through systems that depend on continued expansion. It solves problems using tools that often generate new problems at a larger scale. This is not failure. It is momentum. And momentum, once established, resists change. Civilizations rarely stop because they decide to stop. They stop because conditions change faster than their structures can adapt. Adaptation requires flexibility. Flexibility requires willingness to abandon familiar assumptions. And familiarity is deeply comforting, even when it becomes dangerous. Throughout history, societies that endured were not always the most powerful, the most advanced, or the most ambitious. They were often the most adaptable. They adjusted expectations. They diversified survival strategies. They preserved redundancy rather than eliminating it. Modern civilization, by contrast, has largely traded redundancy for efficiency. Efficiency feels like intelligence, but efficiency leaves little room for surprise. Surprise is inevitable. Natural systems fluctuate. Human behavior is unpredictable. Technological breakthroughs arrive unevenly. Civilization exists within layers of uncertainty that no model can fully capture. Yet the belief in control persists. This belief shapes governance, economics, and culture. Problems are framed as solvable through optimization. Risk is treated as something to be quantified rather than lived with. Long-term uncertainty is discounted in favor of immediate return. These patterns are not malicious. They are structural. They emerge naturally from systems designed to reward short-term success. Over time, this creates tension between what civilization can do and what it should do. Capability expands faster than wisdom. Speed outpaces reflection. Power accumulates faster than responsibility. This imbalance is not new, but its scale is unprecedented. Despite this, civilization is not static. Countercurrents exist. Movements emerge that emphasize sustainability over growth, cooperation over domination, long-term stewardship over short-term extraction. These ideas are not dominant, but they are present, and presence matters. History shows that transformation often begins at the margins before it reaches the center. What appears insignificant at first can reshape systems over time. Civilization does not change all at once. It shifts direction gradually, sometimes imperceptibly, until the new path becomes obvious only in hindsight. At the same time, resistance to change intensifies as systems grow larger. Institutions protect themselves. Identities harden. Narratives simplify complex realities into familiar stories. This resistance is not irrational. It is a defense mechanism. But defense can become denial. Denial delays adaptation, and delay narrows options. Civilizations that survive prolonged stress do so by widening their range of responses, not by doubling down on a single approach. Flexibility is survival. The challenge facing modern civilization is not merely technological or environmental. It is interpretive. How does a global society understand itself? How does it tell its own story? What does it believe civilization is for? These questions shape priorities more powerfully than any single invention. Civilization has always relied on shared meaning. From early myths that justified authority to modern narratives of progress and innovation, belief has guided behavior. When belief fractures, coordination weakens. When belief evolves, new possibilities emerge. At present, civilization stands within a story that is still being negotiated. One version emphasizes endless growth, dominance over nature, and technological salvation. Another emphasizes balance, limits, and responsibility to future generations. Both exist simultaneously. And the tension between them defines the era. The outcome will not be determined by a single event. It will emerge from patterns, from which ideas spread, from which systems prove resilient, from which values guide decisions when trade-offs become unavoidable. For now, civilization holds. It strains, adapts, debates, and continues. The past presses behind it. The future pulls ahead. And between them lies the present moment, unfinished, uncertain, and still in motion. Civilization, when observed over long stretches of time, does not behave like a single organism with a clear direction, but more like a shifting landscape where structures rise, erode, and reform under pressures that are rarely uniform and never entirely predictable. Some regions experience growth while others contract. Some societies stabilize while others fracture. Progress and decline occur simultaneously, often within the same system. This unevenness is not an anomaly. It is the normal state of complex civilization. The human mind, however, seeks coherence. It prefers clear narratives with beginnings, middles, and ends. It searches for heroes, villains, causes, and solutions. Civilization does not conform easily to these expectations. It unfolds through feedback loops, unintended consequences, and delayed effects that resist simple explanation. This gap between how civilization actually functions and how humans prefer to understand it creates discomfort. And discomfort often leads to oversimplification. Oversimplification narrows perception. It turns systemic challenges into isolated problems. It assigns blame where complexity demands analysis. It replaces patience with urgency, even when urgency accelerates mistakes. Throughout history, civilizations under pressure have often responded this way. They searched for certainty in moments that required humility. Yet alongside these tendencies exists another human capacity: reflection, the ability to step back, to observe patterns across time, to recognize that present conditions are part of a much longer story. This capacity has grown stronger as historical knowledge has expanded. Modern civilization knows more about its past than any civilization before it. That knowledge is a resource. Whether it is used remains uncertain. History does not offer instructions. It offers patterns. It shows that civilizations which endure are those that learn to live within limits rather than deny them, those that accept complexity rather than attempt to eliminate it, those that prioritize resilience over perfection. These lessons are rarely obvious while they are being learned. They become clear only after consequences unfold. Modern civilization exists in a state of continuous negotiation between expansion and constraint. Economic systems reward growth. Ecological systems impose boundaries. Technological systems accelerate change. Social systems struggle to adapt. None of these forces operates independently. Each shapes the others. As pressures accumulate, civilization begins to test its own assumptions. Is growth always desirable? Is efficiency always beneficial? Is innovation always progress? These questions, once peripheral, move closer to the center of public discourse during periods of strain. They are signs of transition. Transitions are unstable. Old systems resist replacement. New systems emerge incomplete and imperfect. Uncertainty increases before clarity appears. This instability is often mistaken for failure, but instability can also indicate transformation. Civilization has navigated transitions before, from foraging to farming, from villages to cities, from empires to nation-states, from local economies to global systems. Each shift brought disruption, loss, and adaptation. None were smooth. None were planned in advance. The present transition is distinguished by scale rather than nature. It involves the entire planet. It unfolds at unprecedented speed. It affects systems that support billions of lives simultaneously. This amplifies both risk and responsibility. Responsibility, however, is unevenly distributed. Those with the greatest influence over systems are often the most insulated from their consequences. Those most affected by instability often have the least power to shape outcomes. This imbalance complicates collective response. It creates friction between moral awareness and practical action. Despite these challenges, civilization continues to generate solutions. Technologies evolve. Institutions reform incrementally. Cultural values shift slowly but perceptibly. Change rarely arrives as revolution alone. It often arrives as adjustment layered upon adjustment. What remains uncertain is whether these adjustments will outpace disruption. Civilization does not need perfection to survive. It needs alignment. Alignment between knowledge and action, between capability and restraint, between present benefit and future cost. Alignment is difficult because it requires cooperation across differences of culture, interest, and perspective. Yet civilization itself is evidence that cooperation is possible. Every city, every network, every shared system is built on coordinated effort. The question is not whether humanity can cooperate. It is whether it can do so at the scale and speed required. For now, civilization remains in motion. It absorbs shocks. It generates responses. It carries forward both the wisdom of the past and the momentum of its own inventions. Civilization persists in this state of motion because stopping is not an option it recognizes, not as a deliberate choice, but as an existential condition. Since every system built to sustain human life assumes continuity and resists interruption by design. Infrastructure demands maintenance. Economies demand circulation. Institutions demand participation. To pause would be to risk unraveling connections that took centuries to assemble. And so, civilization moves forward, even when direction feels uncertain. This forward motion often disguises vulnerability. As long as systems function, their fragility remains invisible. As long as needs are met, underlying strain is tolerated. As long as disruptions are temporary, adaptation is delayed. Civilizations rarely respond fully to warnings. They respond to consequences. Warnings, however, accumulate. They appear in data, in lived experience, in environmental shifts, and in social unrest. They are debated, reframed, sometimes dismissed, sometimes acted upon in limited ways. This pattern is familiar. It has repeated across history, though never at such scale or complexity. One of the defining challenges of modern civilization is that its greatest threats are abstract. They unfold gradually. They lack clear beginnings. They do not announce themselves with certainty. Humans are attuned to immediate danger. Civilization now faces dangers that emerge slowly, unevenly, and invisibly. This mismatch between perception and reality complicates response. At the same time, modern civilization has access to unprecedented foresight. Models simulate futures. Trends reveal trajectories. History offers analogs. Knowledge is not absent. What remains contested is interpretation. Different groups read the same information and draw different conclusions about urgency, responsibility, and sacrifice. This divergence shapes action. Civilization, therefore, becomes a negotiation not only between humans and nature, but between humans themselves. Whose priorities matter most? Whose risks are acceptable? Whose futures are protected? These questions have always existed. They are simply more visible now. Visibility, however, does not guarantee resolution. Increased awareness can produce empathy, but it can also produce fatigue, polarization, and withdrawal. The constant presence of global crises can overwhelm the capacity for sustained attention. Civilization struggles not only with external limits, but with cognitive ones. Despite this, the story is not one of inevitability. History does not move toward collapse by default. It moves toward outcomes shaped by interaction, adaptation, and chance. Civilizations fail when feedback is ignored long enough to eliminate options. They endure when they respond while flexibility remains. Flexibility often appears first in unexpected places. In local experimentation rather than global policy. In cultural shifts before institutional reform. In changing values before changing structures. These early signals are easy to overlook, but they matter. Civilization has always evolved through layers. Material conditions change. Social relationships adjust. Belief systems follow. Rarely does transformation occur in reverse order. This sequence explains why change often feels slow, even when pressure is intense. At present, civilization exists in a state of overlapping timelines. Some systems operate on daily cycles, others unfold over decades. Environmental processes span centuries. Aligning decisions across these timescales is one of the most difficult challenges humanity has ever faced. Short-term incentives conflict with long-term consequences. Yet both are real. The future, therefore, will not emerge from a single solution. It will emerge from balance, from compromises between speed and caution, between innovation and preservation, between autonomy and coordination. Balance is not static. It must be continuously adjusted. Civilization has attempted balance before. Sometimes it succeeded temporarily. Sometimes it failed dramatically. The difference often lay not in intelligence or power, but in timing. Respond too early, and effort seems unnecessary. Respond too late, and options vanish. History favors responsiveness. For now, civilization remains within the window where response is possible. That window narrows and widens unpredictably, shaped by feedback, resilience, and unforeseen events. No single moment defines it. No single action secures it. What defines this era is not certainty, but awareness. Humanity knows that its actions matter at planetary scale. It knows that continuation is not guaranteed. It knows that civilization is both remarkable and vulnerable. This knowledge changes the story. It introduces responsibility into history. Civilization moves through this uncertainty the way it always has, by normalizing conditions that would have once seemed extraordinary, by adapting just enough to continue functioning, and by postponing deeper reckoning in favor of maintaining momentum. What once felt unstable becomes familiar. What once felt urgent becomes background noise. Humans adjust their expectations, not because the situation has resolved, but because life continues regardless. This capacity to normalize is one of civilization's greatest strengths. It is also one of its quietest risks. Adaptation without reflection can preserve systems while eroding meaning. When survival becomes routine, questions of purpose fade. When complexity becomes ordinary, responsibility diffuses. When consequences are distant, accountability weakens. Civilization continues to operate, even as its direction becomes harder to articulate. Throughout history, societies have often mistaken continuity for success. If food arrives, if markets function, if institutions persist, it feels as though civilization is healthy. But health is not only stability, it is alignment between structure and reality. Civilizations fail not when they stop working entirely, but when they keep working in ways that no longer fit the world they inhabit. The present era is defined by this misalignment. Systems built for abundance strain under scarcity. Institutions designed for slower change struggle with acceleration. Cultural narratives rooted in expansion clash with planetary limits. None of these tensions exist in isolation. They reinforce one another. Yet civilization is not powerless within this tension. It possesses the ability to pause conceptually, if not materially, to reassess assumptions, to revise priorities, to redefine success. These shifts do not require immediate perfection. They require intention. Intention, however, competes with habit. Habits are deeply embedded in infrastructure, economics, and daily life. Changing them is uncomfortable, expensive, and politically difficult. And so civilization often chooses adjustment over transformation, hoping that incremental change will be enough. Sometimes it is, sometimes it is not. History offers no guarantees. It only shows that civilizations which survive periods of strain do so by widening their range of responses rather than narrowing them. They experiment, they decentralize risk, they preserve diversity in systems, ideas, and strategies. Uniformity is efficient, diversity is resilient. Modern civilization has excelled at efficiency. Whether it can cultivate resilience at the same scale remains an open question. Resilience requires redundancy. It requires tolerance for inefficiency. It requires humility in the face of uncertainty. These qualities are difficult to reward in systems optimized for speed and growth. Despite this, signals of recalibration continue to appear. Communities explore alternative ways of living. Institutions revise long-standing assumptions. Younger generations question inherited definitions of success and progress. These shifts are uneven and incomplete, but they are real. Civilization does not transform through consensus alone. It transforms through pressure, example, and repetition. What works spreads. What fails is eventually abandoned. What endures becomes tradition. This process is slow, but it is continuous. The present moment sits within this slow process. It feels tense because multiple trajectories overlap. One pulls toward continuation of existing patterns. Another pulls toward revision and restraint. A third remains undefined, shaped by innovations not yet fully understood. Civilization follows all three simultaneously. There is no single path forward. There is only navigation, adjustment after adjustment, decision after decision, response after response. History will later call this era a turning point or a prelude or a missed opportunity. Those living within it experience it simply as life. And life, even under strain, continues to generate meaning. People form relationships, they create art, they pursue understanding, they care for one another. Civilization is not only systems and structures, it is lived experience. That experience is shaped by uncertainty, but not defined by it. Uncertainty invites fear, but it also invites imagination. What civilization becomes next depends not only on what it avoids, but on what it chooses to build. Not only on what it preserves, but on what it lets go. For now, civilization remains suspended between what it has been and what it might become. Not collapsing, not resolved, still unfolding. And as it unfolds, it continues to write its story quietly, through countless ordinary moments that, together, will define how this chapter of human history is remembered. Civilization endures within this unfolding moment by relying on a deeply human tendency to compartmentalize, to separate the vastness of historical forces from the intimacy of daily life, allowing individuals to function even when the larger picture feels overwhelming or unresolved. People wake, work, build routines, and plan futures, not because certainty exists, but because meaning is constructed locally, in relationships, responsibilities, and small acts of continuity. This has always been true. Civilizations are sustained not by grand narratives alone, but by ordinary persistence. From a distance, history appears shaped by empires, technologies, and systems. From within, it is shaped by choices that feel personal rather than historical. A career pursued, a family raised, a value defended, a compromise accepted. These choices rarely feel consequential in the moment, yet they accumulate. Accumulation is the quiet engine of civilization. It is how small efficiencies become systemic dependence, how minor inequalities deepen into structural divides, how incremental improvements reshape expectations of normality. It is also how correction becomes possible. Small shifts repeated over time can redirect entire systems. Civilization's challenge, therefore, is not the absence of agency, but the dispersion of it. No single individual controls the trajectory. No single institution commands the whole. Responsibility is distributed across billions of actions, most of them uncoordinated. This diffusion makes blame difficult. It also makes change possible from many directions at once. History reveals that large transformations often emerge from converging pressures rather than singular causes. Economic strain intersects with environmental stress. Technological disruption collides with cultural resistance. Political instability amplifies social fragmentation. When enough pressures align, systems reorganize, sometimes by design, sometimes by necessity. Necessity is a powerful catalyst. It strips away illusion. It exposes assumptions. It forces prioritization. Civilizations under pressure rediscover what they truly value, not what they claim to value. This rediscovery can be painful. It can also be clarifying. At present, civilization is engaged in this process of clarification, not through a single reckoning, but through many overlapping ones. Questions once postponed now surface repeatedly. What is essential? What is sustainable? What is worth preserving, even at cost? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They demand engagement. Engagement, however, competes with exhaustion. The scale of modern challenges can induce paralysis rather than action. When everything feels urgent, focus dissolves. When responsibility feels infinite, motivation weakens. Civilization must therefore manage not only material systems, but emotional and psychological capacity. Resilience is not only structural, it is cognitive. It depends on whether societies can sustain attention, empathy, and cooperation over long periods without retreating into denial or division. This may be one of the least visible yet most critical dimensions of survival. History offers reassurance here as well. Human societies have endured prolonged uncertainty before. They have lived through transitions without knowing their outcomes. They have navigated periods where the future felt opaque and the present unstable. What carried them through was not foresight alone, but adaptability combined with shared meaning. Meaning does not require unanimity. It requires enough overlap to allow coordination. Civilization has always balanced diversity of belief with functional agreement. Too much uniformity suffocates innovation. Too much fragmentation prevents action. The balance shifts over time. The present moment is one of recalibration. Old alignments loosen. New ones form tentatively. Experiments proceed unevenly. Some fail quickly. Others persist quietly, gaining strength through repetition. This is how civilization evolves. Not in sweeping declarations, but in gradual realignment. The visible moments, crises, reforms, breakthroughs, are merely the surface expressions of deeper processes already underway. What remains constant across all eras is uncertainty. Civilizations never know their future while they are living it. They interpret signs, argue over meaning, and act with incomplete information. The present is no different. Yet there is something distinct about this moment. For the first time, humanity understands that civilization itself is contingent, not destined, not permanent, not guaranteed. This understanding does not doom civilization. It changes the stakes. Awareness introduces choice. Choice introduces responsibility. And responsibility, though burdensome, also opens possibility. Civilization is no longer only reacting to the world. It is reflecting on itself. That reflection does not resolve tension, but it alters trajectory. It slows some impulses. It amplifies others. It reshapes what is considered acceptable, desirable, or inevitable. For now, civilization remains unfinished. It continues to adapt within constraints it did not choose, using tools it only partially understands, guided by values still in negotiation. The story does not resolve here. It deepens. And it continues forward, not toward a fixed destination, but through an ongoing process of becoming, shaped by countless lives unfolding simultaneously within a shared, fragile, and extraordinary experiment called civilization. Civilization carries itself forward through this process of becoming by relying on continuity more than certainty, by trusting that movement itself will reveal options that remain invisible while standing still, even when that movement feels hesitant or conflicted. Throughout history, societies have rarely paused to redesign themselves from first principles. They have adjusted while in motion. They have repaired while under strain. They have learned while making mistakes. Modern civilization is doing the same. What distinguishes the present is not the presence of danger, but the simultaneity of pressures arriving from multiple directions at once. Environmental limits press against economic expectations. Technological capability outpaces social integration. Global interdependence strains institutions built for sovereignty and separation. These pressures do not announce a single solution. They demand navigation. Navigation requires orientation. Civilizations orient themselves through values, stories, and shared assumptions about what matters. When those assumptions shift, direction changes. When they fracture, momentum becomes erratic. Much of the tension felt today arises from competing orientations operating at the same time. Some narratives emphasize preservation of existing structures, prioritizing stability over transformation. Others emphasize reinvention, seeing disruption as opportunity rather than threat. Between them lies a vast middle ground of adaptation, where most people live, work, and decide. Civilization moves according to this middle more than its extremes. The middle is rarely dramatic. It is composed of adjustments that appear small, technical, or mundane. Standards change. Practices evolve. Expectations shift. Over time, these changes accumulate into transformation. This accumulation is difficult to perceive from within. Living through transition feels like confusion rather than progress. Certainty fades before clarity emerges. Civilizations rarely know they are adapting successfully until long after the fact. History shows that endurance does not require perfect foresight. It requires responsiveness, the ability to notice feedback, the willingness to revise course, the humility to abandon strategies that no longer work. These qualities are cultural as much as structural. Culture shapes what is considered normal. Normal determines what is tolerated. Tolerated conditions persist. This is why cultural change often precedes systemic change, even when systems appear dominant. When enough people redefine normal, institutions eventually follow. Modern civilization is experiencing this redefinition unevenly. What feels urgent in one region feels distant in another. What feels obvious to one generation feels radical to another. These differences create friction, but they also create dialogue. Dialogue, though slow, is a mechanism of adaptation. Adaptation does not eliminate loss. Every transition leaves something behind. Skills become obsolete. Ways of life disappear. Certainties dissolve. Civilizations that endure acknowledge loss without allowing it to immobilize them. They carry memory forward while making room for change. Memory itself is selective. Civilizations remember triumphs more readily than failures. They mythologize origins and simplify endings. Yet within memory lie lessons, waiting to be reinterpreted by new contexts. The past does not instruct directly. It informs indirectly. As civilization continues, it draws from this reservoir of memory while confronting conditions that memory alone cannot solve. No previous society faced planetary-scale interdependence combined with technological acceleration. Analogy helps, but it is insufficient. Creativity becomes necessary. Creativity is not limited to art or invention. It includes new forms of cooperation, governance, and responsibility. It includes imagining futures that do not replicate the assumptions of the past. This imagination is unevenly distributed, but it exists. Civilization's future will be shaped not only by constraints, but by what people believe is possible within them. Belief influences effort. Effort influences outcome. Even limited possibility can expand when enough energy is directed toward it. For now, civilization continues to test boundaries. Some will hold, some will shift, some will fail. Failure does not end the story, it redirects it. History reminds us that collapse and continuity are not opposites. They often coexist. Systems fall while others emerge. Loss occurs alongside renewal. Civilization is not a single structure that either stands or falls. It is a process that transforms. The present moment sits within that transformation, unresolved, contested, still unfolding. Civilization continues in this state of unfolding not because it has resolved its contradictions, but because contradiction itself has always been part of its structure, a tension between what humans desire and what reality permits, between imagination and limitation, between expansion and restraint. Every civilization that has ever existed lived inside this tension. What changes is the scale. In earlier eras, limits were often encountered suddenly and locally. A river changed course. A harvest failed. An enemy arrived. The consequences were immediate, visible, and confined. Today, limits reveal themselves slowly and globally. They emerge as trends rather than events, as probabilities rather than certainties, as signals that require interpretation rather than reaction. This makes them easier to debate and harder to confront. Civilization now exists in a prolonged moment of interpretation. Data accumulates faster than consensus. Evidence grows clearer even as agreement fragments. Understanding expands while alignment lags behind. This gap between knowing and doing defines the present age. Knowing on its own does not compel action. Civilizations act when knowledge intersects with motivation, capacity, and shared purpose. Without shared purpose, even accurate understanding can remain inert. And shared purpose is difficult to sustain in a world defined by diversity, speed, and constant change. Yet diversity has always been one of civilization's strengths. Different perspectives generate resilience. Multiple approaches increase the chance that at least some will succeed. Uniform civilizations are brittle. Plural civilizations adapt. The challenge lies not in difference itself, but in coordinating difference without erasing it. Coordination at scale requires trust. Trust in institutions, trust in information, trust in one another. When trust weakens, cooperation becomes transactional rather than collective. Civilization can function this way for a time, but strain accumulates. Trust is not restored through instruction. It is rebuilt through experience, through systems that demonstrate reliability, through leadership that aligns words with outcomes, through fairness that is felt, not merely promised. History shows that trust, once broken, returns slowly. But it does return. Civilization's story has always included cycles of trust and erosion, cohesion and fragmentation. These cycles do not follow fixed schedules. They respond to conditions. When systems deliver security and meaning, trust grows. When they fail to do so, trust contracts. The present moment reflects this contraction. But contraction is not collapse. It is pressure. Pressure reveals structure. It exposes weak points. It highlights dependencies. It forces prioritization. Civilizations often learn most about themselves under strain. What they protect reveals what they value. What they abandon reveals what they consider expendable. Modern civilization is learning in real time which systems are essential, which can bend, which cannot. Energy, food, water, communication, and social cohesion emerge repeatedly as foundations. Without them, everything else falters. Recognizing foundations is only the first step. The next is redesigning systems so that foundations are protected not only during stability, but during disruption. This is the shift from optimization to resilience, from maximizing output to preserving function, from assuming continuity to planning for interruption. This shift challenges deeply embedded assumptions that growth must always be positive, that speed is inherently good. That complexity guarantees advancement. Letting go of these assumptions does not mean rejecting progress. It means redefining it. Progress in this emerging context becomes less about accumulation and more about durability. Not how much can be produced, but how long systems can sustain life without collapse. Not how fast change occurs, but how well societies absorb it. Such redefinitions take time. They encounter resistance. They provoke anxiety. They disrupt identities built around older narratives. Civilization does not shed its stories easily. Stories give coherence to effort. Yet stories evolve when reality demands it. They stretch, they fracture, they recombine. New meanings emerge, often borrowing language from the past while altering its intent. This is how civilizations renew themselves without forgetting who they were. The present era is thick with this narrative experimentation. Competing visions of the future circulate simultaneously. Some promise restoration, some promise transformation, some promise escape. None are complete. But together, they signal transition. Transition is uncomfortable. It feels unstable because it is. Old certainties dissolve before new ones solidify. Civilizations in transition often appear chaotic to those living within them. Only later does structure become visible. History suggests that what feels like disorder from the inside often appears in retrospect as reorganization. The pieces do not vanish. They rearrange. For now, civilization remains mid-rearrangement. Systems overlap awkwardly. Values conflict. Solutions remain partial. But movement continues. What carries civilization forward through such moments is not confidence, but capacity. The capacity to learn. The capacity to adjust. The capacity to imagine alternatives. These capacities persist even when clarity does not. Civilization advances through this extended moment of awareness much like a river moving through changing terrain, sometimes narrowing, sometimes widening, sometimes flowing smoothly and sometimes breaking into turbulence, yet always reshaped by the landscape through which it passes. At times, the current feels slow, almost stagnant, as if nothing meaningful is happening. At other moments, change accelerates so quickly that it becomes difficult to recognize familiar landmarks. Both conditions are part of the same movement. What often escapes notice is how deeply civilization is shaped by expectations about the future. People act not only based on present conditions, but on what they believe tomorrow will demand. If the future is imagined as abundant, behavior becomes expansive. If it is imagined as scarce, behavior becomes defensive. If it is imagined as uncertain, behavior becomes cautious or fragmented. These imagined futures influence decisions long before outcomes are visible. In this way, civilization is guided as much by perception as by reality. Markets respond to belief. Institutions respond to anticipation, Societies respond to narratives about what is coming. This makes storytelling a form of power, not propaganda, but framing. The way civilization explains itself to itself matters. Throughout history, moments of transition have been accompanied by competing stories about decline and renewal. Some insist that the best days lie behind, that stability requires returning to an earlier form. Others argue that the future demands departure from the past, even if the destination is unclear. Most civilizations move forward not by choosing one story entirely, but by blending elements of both. They preserve what still works. They discard what no longer does. They experiment where certainty is absent. Experimentation is often misunderstood as recklessness. In reality, it is how civilizations probe the boundaries of possibility without committing fully to untested paths. Small trials, localized changes, incremental reforms. Some fail quietly, some succeed and spread. This is adaptation in practice. Modern civilization is experimenting constantly, though rarely in a coordinated way. New technologies alter communication, labor, and identity. New social arrangements challenge long-standing hierarchies. New economic models attempt to reconcile growth with constraint. None provide complete answers, but together they expand the range of options. Options matter. Civilizations collapse when options disappear, when resources are exhausted, when trust erodes completely, when institutions lose legitimacy faster than alternatives can form. As long as options exist, transformation remains possible. One of the paradoxes of the present era is that civilization possesses more options than ever before, yet often feels constrained. This constraint arises not from lack of possibility, but from interdependence. Choices in one domain affect many others. Trade-offs become unavoidable. Progress in one area may create loss in another. Navigating these trade-offs requires collective judgment. Collective judgment is slow. It involves debate, disagreement, revision, and compromise. In a world accustomed to speed, slowness can feel like failure. But slowness is sometimes a form of care. It allows consequences to be considered before they are irreversible. Civilizations that endure learn when to accelerate and when to pause. They do not treat speed as a virtue in itself. They align pace with capacity. This alignment is difficult to achieve. It requires restraint at moments when expansion feels rewarding. Restraint, historically, has been one of civilization's least celebrated qualities. Yet it is often what preserves continuity. Limits create space for regeneration. Boundaries prevent exhaustion. Patience allows learning. These principles appear repeatedly in societies that survive prolonged stress. The challenge is that restraint rarely feels heroic. It lacks spectacle. It does not generate immediate reward, but over time it shapes trajectories more reliably than force. As civilization continues forward, the question becomes less about avoiding every risk and more about choosing which risks to take. Total safety is impossible. Total control is an illusion. What matters is proportionality. Which risks are acceptable? Which are reversible? Which threaten foundations rather than margins? Answering these questions requires shared values. Not uniform values, but overlapping ones. Enough agreement to act together, even without complete consensus. This has always been the basis of civilizational coordination. The present era tests this capacity at unprecedented scale. Billions of lives are connected through systems that demand cooperation, even as differences persist. This tension does not signal failure. It signals complexity. Complex systems do not resolve neatly. They oscillate. They adapt unevenly. They absorb shocks and reconfigure. Civilization is no exception. What remains consistent across time is that civilizations do not survive by clinging rigidly to their past forms. They survive by carrying forward principles while altering structures. Community, meaning, continuity. These persist even as expressions change. The current moment invites civilization to remember this, that systems are tools, not ends. that growth is a means, not a purpose. That survival depends not only on power, but on wisdom applied at the right moments. Civilization, when seen from far enough away, is not a monument built once and preserved forever, but a rhythm, an ongoing act of balance between what humans can imagine and what the world will allow, between the desire to endure and the inevitability of change. It rises when conditions align. It transforms when pressures demand it. It fades when it can no longer adapt. And yet, something always continues. Not the same cities, not the same empires, not the same systems or beliefs, but the impulse to gather, to organize, to create meaning beyond survival. That impulse survived ice ages, collapses, and forgotten worlds. It survived the fall of empires whose names once seemed eternal. It survived silence, ruin, and time itself. Civilization is not the buildings we leave behind. It is the patterns we repeat, the lessons we half remember, and the questions we continue to ask. Every generation believes it stands at the edge of history. In truth, it stands inside a much longer story, one shaped by countless lives that never knew how their choices would echo forward. We are not the first to wonder if civilization can last. We will not be the last. What endures is not certainty, but continuity, not perfection, but persistence. Civilization does not end in a single moment. It changes form. It sheds one skin and grows another. And long after today becomes another layer of forgotten time, long after our answers fade into questions once more, something human will still remain. Looking at the world, learning its limits, and beginning again. That is the history of civilization. Not a straight line, not a finished story, but an unbroken attempt to live, to understand, and to endure.